So yesterday after my live stream show, there was some excellent posts and comments under the video by my friend Nicholas. He's a very smart guy. I respect him. He has a lot of good ideas. He posted some good ideas about how government, the federal government, can be fixed. And I'll read you guys these ideas, but unfortunately, and I'm going to lay out why, because based on my experience and talking with people here in DC at all different levels and sources and stuff over the years, just my about 20 years of experience here in DC. Yes, my sources are not as good as Dr. Dave Janda, but also I'm not making ridiculously crazy outlandish predictions with no verifiable way to prove any of this stuff. So I'm going to be citing like news stories and other stuff that have come out that you can actually verify. And, I've heard these stories for years, and the news stories that have come out are only proof of the stuff that I've heard is correct. So Nicholas talks about some really excellent ideas to try to fix the federal government. He talks about we can get involved in politics before the primaries so that we have candidates to choose from who aren't horrible. It's a good idea. It's a good idea. Unfortunately, you have all of these parties are so corrupt, especially the Democrat Party, and there's just enormous opposition research and blackmail and other stuff going on, dirt being dug up, that basically you're looking at what happened to Donald Trump and his family if you are a businessman and you want to get involved in politics. So basically, not only do you have to sacrifice your income, you're also looking at getting your good name, if you have a good name and good reputation, potentially ruined and dragged through the mud. Donald Trump's brand has lost, and his family's brand, especially Ivanka's brand, has lost over $400 million total in value. And look at the endless amounts of basically subpoenas and investigations and potentially indictments coming out of New York for the Trump family. And that's for the tiny little Trump Foundation, which, by the way, is like a little tiny little pimple on someone's butt cheek compared to the Clinton Foundation. All the crazy stuff that went on there. So, Nicholas, I think you're a smart guy. I respect you. But here in the Washington, D.C. metro area, there is basically a small army of pretty darn highly paid, in some cases, consultants, lobbyists, and bureaucrats who do not want change, who's either themselves, and they're supposed to be public servants and putting the good of the country before, but that's not how things are in reality, or they're being hired by a corporation or a special interest group. 3 major governments I outlined, but there's other governments involved, and other big industries and stuff like that. And so you have a bunch of good ideas. I could read more of them and just go line by line through some of them with why these are maybe in the long term, some of these things can be implemented and fixed, but in the short term, none of these things are going to really be implemented. I'm sorry, but that's the truth. So Dr. Dave Janda, who's a very smart guy, he's an orthopedist. My dad is a retired orthopedist. I respect orthopedists. He's probably a really good doctor, but I would not be taking any political advice from him, especially when he's been saying all this stuff about the QAnon stuff for years is true. And also he made some ridiculous prediction that no one's calling him out for on Greg Hunter a couple years ago about how a Chinese admiral or something like that was about to launch a nuclear warhead from a submarine at the U.S. You can't verify any of this stuff. So let me give you some examples of how bad things are in DC. It's really sad. So one of the main overhanging themes here in DC is that once Trump got elected, not only did he not, and Mike Cernovich talks about this, Cernovich does a good job about this stuff. And Cernovich talks about how Trump did not do a good job hiring his own supporters and making sure that he brought them in to a lot of the key appointee positions and also a lot of the other mid-level bureaucrat positions. He could have done this, he could have fought harder, and he didn't really do it. Instead, a lot of the Republicans that hang around here and are always looking to get new jobs, so the neocons, the kind of the retread Republicans from both Bush family, they're always looking to, find new jobs and get consulting gigs and all this stuff, and Trump hired a lot of them. Some of the other major problems, and you won't hear hardly anyone talking about this. So there is, for those of you not familiar with the federal bureaucracy, there is the United States Office of Personnel Management, okay? They do a bunch of for the non-military and security clearance, they do some of the security clearance stuff, but the non-military hires, they do a bunch of that in the bureaucracy. And there are many hundreds of Trump appointees through a bunch of different government agencies that are not getting approved and hired. Okay, this has been going on for a while. Way over a year, over 2 years actually, since the inauguration. He has not been able to get a lot of his political appointees through. So the Office of Personnel Management, which by the way, guys, is career bureaucrats, almost all of them. And we see this with the voting patterns in not only in Washington, D.C. itself, which had over 90%, I believe, Democrat voting, and it's been this way for a while now. Also, the Northern Virginia area and the more affluent counties, and even the poor counties like, I think, Prince George's, PGC, which, by the way, is becoming more gentrified, similar to how Brooklyn became gentrified. Now, like, poor people are having to move out of PGC because it's starting to get a ton of investment there, like what happened with Brooklyn. But those counties are also very hardcore Democrat. And so you have a situation where a lot of these government agencies, so even though President Trump has been able to get most of his his secretaries appointed, and you have a situation where almost all the people beneath Trump's appointees, his secretaries, are leaking, are sabotaging, are delaying intentionally. And this happened, I've learned more of the truth about Ronald Reagan, but Ronald Reagan did have good ideas, at least some of them, and he ran into the same damn problems, okay? And you have a situation where these career bureaucrats, a lot of them who cannot be fired, and I've met some of these bureaucrats in person. I've had discussions with them. This was before I became a libertarian. This was before I was as skeptical of both political parties and government. This is where I actually, when I was younger and more naive, actually thought that there could be some change, that change candidates from either political party could come here and actually make a difference. A lot of the change candidates, and this has been going on for decades, have come to the DC metro area here, and a lot of them are offered literally millions of dollars to give up their principles, to sell out. Okay, and that's why you see a bunch of different congressmen who come here middle-aged with basically no connections, no investments or anything like that, maybe a tiny little pension, and maybe they're 50 years old or late 40s, worth like a couple $100,000, and by the time they leave here 10 years later, give or take, they're worth way over $5 million. Because this is how bad the Washington, D.C. metro area is, okay? It does not want change. There are a bunch of entities in the area, and I name them, like these consultants, the lobbyists, which represent the corporations, and also foreign governments. Why are all these foreign governments allowed to hire lobbyists to disrupt and create problems and inefficiencies and misallocate capital in the federal government here in Washington, D.C. metro area? So there's a bunch of these problems that have to be fixed, okay? We need a bunch of these problems fixed. So Nicholas is a very smart guy. Let me see if I can pull up. For some reason, this is not loading here. I don't know why. That's weird. Let me restart that. Hopefully the audio. Okay, 1 second here. Let me see if I can get this up, because I want to read. He has good ideas. They're very good ideas, and I would love it if they could get implemented. But I can tell you for a fact, and I've spoken with some government employees who are frustrated, who want to do the right thing, and they are chastised. They are made fun of at the office, the ones who want to do the right thing. They have to keep their mouth shut sometimes, or they just quit out of frustration. And so the good ones who want to actually change and fix things and want to implement what the American people want are voted out and gotten rid of. They're weeded out. Okay, so Nicholas says that Trump has cut a lot of regulations for small businesses. He has appointed judges. He's building a wall to keep wages up. He scrapped the TPP. He is offering a trade deal to the UK. He kept us out of the Paris Accord. He is standing up to the socialist UN, and he's kept the deep state from doing to him what it did to JFK. So I think a lot of these things are true. The regulation stuff is still bad. The federal government is too large. There are still too many rules and regulations for a lot of entrepreneurs and small businesses, okay? So it is not nearly enough. There has to be more done. And there are things that can be done with the judges. So there will be attempts by the Democrats, once they regain more of Congress and or the presidency, to start forcing out the older Republican judges to balance things back, or they can change the rules, trying to force some of these judges into either early retirement. And the other thing that people are not aware of is how a lot of cases, and there's tons of lawsuits that you can go back through with case law, and I study these both undergraduate and some in law school, is that there's all these federal government agencies, and routinely they ignore a lot of the stuff with the court. They either ignore court orders or they delay, and then they countersue, and then they block things in court for a while. So just because Trump has more of his judges appointed does not mean that everything's going to be fixed. Now, this will probably delay a lot of the globalist agenda, but it's not going to fully solve things. The deep state and the globalists and the Democrats do not give up. Okay, so this is a never-ending battle, unfortunately. And a lot of Trump's trade deals, so the TPP he's not in, but unfortunately a lot of the Trump trade deals are not as good as advertised. They are very similar to like NAFTA and stuff. So there's not an enormous amount of differences between the trade deals that Trump negotiated and NAFTA. The only changes were I think 75% of certain automotive parts have to be here in the US, and they have to be of a certain salaried worker. But then you're forcing higher costs throughout the supply chain, and those jobs might not be human jobs, they might be automated. So there might be a few humans if there is a plant kept here in the United States, but there might be a lot more automation. So that would allow the company to keep revenues here in the US, but not necessarily hire more humans. Because the way everything is going, even because China has had enormous wage increases too, I think about 600% in wage increases over the last 15 or 20 years in China. And China's also automating a lot of factories, or the real cheap labor is even leaving China now. It's going to Vietnam and Bangladesh and other places. But the other point I wanted to make, besides the Office of Management and Personnel, is that a lot of these secretaries and political appointees that President Trump has appointed, I know for a fact, and there are stories about this in the Washington Post, the New York Times, it gets leaked to CNN, it gets leaked to all the mainstream media people. And you know what? It's the federal government employees, the bureaucrats who are doing it. Okay? So Nicholas has really good ideas about education vouchers and fixing the educational system. I have met Department of Education employees, okay, in person. I have seen them on dating apps. Most of them are women. Most of them have 2 or 3 degrees, sometimes even PhDs, and they're only hired from 10 or 12 different schools, mostly Ivy League or University of Michigan or Stanford, and their dating profiles and the Attorney General's office, the Department of Justice, is pretty similar in this regard. Is a lot of these dating profiles, the women say on there that, and hate is a strong word, okay? I don't use hate lightly. Hate is a very, very strong word, and so a lot of people saying they hate this or they hate that is probably overusing the word. But I have literally read, and I have screenshots of this, where there's Department of Education employees, women ones, who are writing on their dating profiles that they hate Republicans, they hate Trump, they hate capitalism, and, you can just pretty much detect undertones that they also hate men, but they're on dating websites and looking for men anyway. And then they say how they're resisting everything they can that Trump's doing. And meanwhile, you connect the dots like that, and you see evidence like this out in public, and I've heard discussions and I've heard friends tell me discussions of just people blatantly like laughing about how they're delaying policy being implemented or sabotaging. James O'Keefe of Project Veritas has some of this stuff on video. Well, you know what? He got 1 or 2 examples. I can tell you I've heard dozens of examples of this. And you know what? Almost everyone around here in the DC, I don't think this is funny, but a lot of people in the DC metro area, when they hear examples of this, like sabotage and leaking and stuff, they think it's funny. Okay? This is how broken and corrupt and inefficient the system is. And so you have, whether it's Dr. Ben Carson, who's Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Scott Pruitt, who stepped down as Environmental Protection Head after ethics management scandals, Betsy DeVos, who's the Secretary of Education, and what's her other name? The other secretary, Kirstjen Nielsen, who is Secretary of Homeland Security. You have people, bureaucrats in there who are actively sabotaging, actively leaking, actively ignoring or delaying policy. Okay? And they know they're not doing their job, and they know for the most part that they can get away with it. And for the most part, they know that they can't be fired. Okay? And once in a while, very rarely, by the way, and the only reason that that lady who was in Antifa and the American Socialist Party or whatever was actually fired was because she was caught on video. And it was so embarrassing to the agency that a head or two had to roll. Okay? So they will pretend that they are changing. They will pretend that there is reform. And then it will go back after 1 or 2 employees are fired based on that Project Veritas video. After the 1 or 2 employees are fired and the 1 or 2 heads have rolled, it will be immediately right back to business as normal. Wasting money and just waiting out Trump until he is gone. Until it's back to whatever Obama was doing or whoever the next president is after Trump. And this is why it's dangerous to have such a large bureaucracy, okay? Because the bureaucracy is not really held accountable. We cannot vote them out. At least with Congress, we can kind of vote them out, although the system is rigged with so much money that's raised. The incumbent has such an advantage in a lot of cases. It's very tough to get rid of them, especially if the corporations want them. Occasionally, we can get rid of an incumbent politician, but with the bureaucracy, we cannot vote them out. They are not held accountable. So this frustrates me. Nicholas, you have excellent ideas. These ideas have been suggested for a long time. I remember President George W. Bush was talking about education vouchers, and the media, the mainstream media, the bureaucrats here, especially the Department of Education, was calling him all kinds of mean names. Like his political appointee for his Secretary of Education was on board with the vouchers, but from what I remember, this was a while ago, and I interned at the White House about a little after I graduated college. I was answering phones about a block away from the White House for a while. So I heard scuttlebutt in there from other employees and stuff. And I've dealt with bureaucrats for a while now. Okay, that was when I wasn't a libertarian, I was a regular Republican, and, I was just like a college kid, basically. I just graduated college, and I didn't know what the hell I was doing. And I was like, I'm going to get some internships and see what happens. And sorry, I got a little off tangent. And the voucher stuff, which was a good idea, because then the parents and the kids could pick out a better school and then use the voucher to go to another school, right? It makes sense to use resources a little bit more efficiently. And, the people inside the Department of Education, except for the George W. Bush appointees, hated it. They wanted it gone. They were so angry. And so they just knew that they would wait out George W. Bush, or they would delay or sabotage. And if the head of the Department of Education made any mistakes, they wasted money or did any of these things. And this is why you saw the EPA, the head of the EPA guy, Scott Pruitt, gotten rid of so quickly, because almost every single bureaucrat inside the EPA hated him. So they were just looking for anything they could to leak to the mainstream media to get rid of him. So these are people that are supposed to be their political appointee. They're supposed to do their job. Okay, so if the political appointee comes in and lays out the agenda, they're supposed to implement the policy that the American people wanted, voted for the president, and the president told the secretary to implement. And you know what? They're not doing it. Unless, of course, it was Obama. Then they would, or someone similar to Obama, then they would do it. And this frustrates me. Most American people do not understand this, exactly how the game is played here in D.C. So this is why, for decades now, you have had change candidates come to D.C., Republicans and Democrats, and most of them end up selling out or giving up, and they don't really implement any change. And that is because the swamp, the bureaucracy, the consultants, the lobbyists, the large corporations who are paying for these lobbyists, and the foreign governments who are paying for these lobbyists, and the special interest groups who are paying for these lobbyists do not want real change. They want a broken system because they can make money from it. They can stick these garbage things into bills that have nothing to do with the bill itself and just rape and pillage and steal more money. It is incredibly frustrating. Hello, D's Nuts. My insight is miles further than Dave Janda in a good way. Yeah, well, he gets over 100,000 views per video, and I get not even barely 1,000 now. So it is what it is. I'm doing the best I can. I'm trying to give you guys the best information. Look, I would love for Nicholas's ideas to work out. Unfortunately, the system here in the Washington, D.C. metro area, the swamp, and all these different entities, no one wants change. Like I said last night on the live stream, that when you occasionally have a person acknowledge the debt problem, they want spending cuts, not in their government agency, not with the government contracts they have. So until this changes and someone is willing to do what's best for the country, there's not going to be any real change. The system, until you show me evidence otherwise, and Nicholas has great ideas, and you could read. I should probably copy and paste them and put them somewhere in the information section of this live stream show for the video when it's done. He has great ideas, but they're maybe long term, and there are thousands of people here in the Washington, D.C. metro area getting paid a lot of money to stop them and sabotage them. And I wish this wasn't true, but I have to speak out because I've been here too long and I'm just fed up. Hey, Billy, thank you for sending me the kind words. I appreciate it. Hello, Wendy. Yes, the Washington, D.C. metro area is very similar to Rome, from the Roman Empire the last couple hundred years. So it's just going to keep going like this and becoming more broken and corrupt and inefficient and more big and bloated and more immoral and morally bankrupt until the system just cannot survive anymore. So it's just going to go on and on and on. I believe it was either Ronald Reagan or another candidate talked about the barn, cleaning out the barn. So the Drain the Swamp is just this generation's version of cleaning out the barn. I think it was Ronald Reagan who said that. It was either Reagan or another candidate within about a couple election cycles of Reagan. So nothing is really new. Nicholas has excellent ideas, but none of them are really truly new. But until the problems that I identified are fixed, and you know what? The bureaucracy, as a libertarian, I want limited government, okay? The federal government is already too big. It spends and wastes too much money, welfare, warfare, bureaucracy, etc. And there just has to be so many bureaucrats that don't do their job. They complain about being overworked and underpaid, and some of these guys are making over $100,000 a year with Cadillac healthcare and pension and a really cushy pension plan, and they're still complaining, and they don't really do much work, and they're sabotaging and leaking. It just frustrates me, but this is the system we have, and this is why you see so many leaks to the mainstream media. So all these government agencies, number one, they either shouldn't exist or their budgets should be cut massively, because they're actively hurting a lot of the economy. And the federal government is so big at this point that it's crowding out a lot of entrepreneurship and small business. And the small business that is being created in the DC metro area, a lot of these guys are now parasites too, that are competing for one or two large government contracts from the Pentagon or another federal government agency. So they're not doing any innovation, creating new products or services. They're looking for a big fat government contract where they have one or two customers so they can overcharge a federal government agency. So this goes back to waste, fraud, corruption, and abuse. And the system will go on until it doesn't. Hey, Jesse, thank you for the super chat donation. I appreciate it. And I'm a voice of sanity in this crazy world. I try, man. Well, what most people don't know about Rome is that Rome also had civil wars. And that's actually how Julius Caesar, his family was a wealthy patrician family. And his family chose the wrong side in a civil war in Rome. And his family lost everything and became impoverished. And that's why Julius Caesar had to join the military. And so he always had a chip on his shoulder. And he was just angry and really angry at the world. But he was a great in the military, and then he rose back up that way. So the U.S. has had one civil war, but, it's looking like we're headed towards another one. Peter brings up the age of Diocletian. Yeah, I think we've seen this in Oregon with statewide rent control. I think a lot of these politicians, because they're looking at populists, and a lot of people want socialism, they're looking at wage and price controls now, because people can just not afford the higher taxes and the currency devaluation, the inflation that is destroying their standard of living. Mars Motion, the federal government, you see the country breaking into regions. That's an interesting theory. So there are a lot of people proposing that in California and elsewhere. The problem is that all these states owe the federal government so much money, and the government wants the money paid back, or they want the power. Federal government wants the power and doesn't want to relinquish it. So one of the ways the U.S. federal government consolidated so much extra power, and this started decades ago after World War II, was a National Highway Act, because a lot of states had much lower drinking ages and other stuff, and the federal government just bribed the states, got them into all the different states into massive amounts of debt in exchange for all the infrastructure money. So I don't see the federal government giving up the power it has without a fight, but we'll see. It's a possibility. We'll see what happens with the European Union, because the European Union doesn't make a lot of sense to be together. It was CIA created, according to an article from, oh God, I forgot his name. It's the British guy that writes all the articles for one of the UK papers. Ambrose Pritchard Evans. He wrote the article like 2 or 3 years ago talking about how the European Union was all academics and CIA, and then they convinced a bunch of technocrats and bureaucrats all over from Brussels to London and Germany and elsewhere. So there's not a natural European Union. The United States is more natural, I would say. The states being Americans have more in common than a lot of Europeans together. But yes, it's a possibility, but the federal government, I would, for the regions to be separate, I would have to see the federal government lose a ton of its power first. So this is not a market show today. I just wanted to say that I respect Nicholas's suggestions and opinions, and long term, they may have a chance to work. But none of these proposals are really new, and they've been suggested for decades. And the system, most people don't realize this because they don't study history, and the people who study history don't really learn from history, especially when it's politicians, because they mostly care about getting reelected and then getting rich before they leave. And the truth of the matter is that, especially in most major U.S. cities, there's been political machines there. I mean, look at the city of Chicago. When was the last time Chicago had a Republican mayor? So, I mean, there's just enormously corrupt and bloated and just really difficult political machines. So it's been going this way for a while. Yeah, Detroit and Chicago are really bad examples of this. There's a lot of really bad political machines. So until we have that, the two-party system has stacked the deck. Ron Paul got screwed as bad or worse than Bernie Sanders did in the 2016 election. Ron Paul actually won the Iowa straw poll, and he won the CPAC polls too, I believe. And then the mainstream Fox News and the other mainstream media, even though Ron Paul was gaining enormous popularity and populism in the 2008 and 2012 elections, presidential ones, they just refused to give him any debate time. So he was polling superbly. He had a decent shot at the nomination, but the mainstream media and the corporations and obviously the Federal Reserve went out of their way to make sure that he was totally screwed over. The Republican Party, too, they didn't want him there because Ron Paul is anti-neocon. So that meant the military-industrial complex was going to get an enormous budget cut. You don't hear people talk anymore about how badly screwed Ron Paul was in those two presidential elections. You hear about Bernie Sanders getting screwed in 2016 and then Bernie taking the money to be quiet about it. Okay, well, we're at 30 minutes. I could go on and on with stories about government bureaucrats, but the bottom line is that there are a lot of people, a lot of them making over $65,000 per year here in the DC metro area, who are incentivized, or depending upon how you look at it, disincentivized to make sure there is no massive amounts of change in the system. And so until this changes, there won't be any real change. So the swamp, Donald Trump's not going to drain the swamp. I talked about this in the last couple of videos. He has reduced some regulation, like Nicholas pointed out. He has done a few good things with the judges, but he is up against a enormously powerful and corrupt system. And look what they're doing to the man's family. Do you think that other candidates that are wealthy, like Donald Trump, and most people are not wealthy like Donald Trump who would think about running, but do you think that people who want to fix the country are going to be willing to come forward when their family members could be investigated, subpoenaed, their financial situation totally ruined for a decade? Because it's looking like even after Donald Trump is out of the White House, his family and friends are going to be dealing with investigations and subpoenas for a very, very long time. And this stuff's not fair. Did we see any of this stuff happen to the Democrats when all the scandals were buried in the Obama administration? Obama's still claiming, and the mainstream media is claiming this, that he didn't lie and that he had a scandal-free White House, which is just totally ridiculous. The only people who are talking about the scandals were like Judicial Watch and Daily Caller and a few other alternative media, but most of the considered somewhat normal mainstream media was not talking. Even Fox News was not talking about a lot of the Democrat scandals until now that Trump's in the White House. It's just really sad. Okay, well, that's it for today. Everyone have a nice day. And I'll get back, now that I've been talking about political stuff and corruption stuff for a while. Hopefully I can focus on market stuff now going forward. Okay, bye.